Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976. Allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use.
Sisu, Road to Revenge emerges not merely as a continuation of a brutal wartime saga, but as a meditation on suffering, survival, and the unyielding force that drives a man who has lost everything. At its core, the film extends the mythology of Atami Korpi, a man shaped by war, stripped by grief, and reforged by the kind of determination that borders on legend. When the first film introduced him as a silent, almost supernatural survivor pulling gold from the earth in the frozen wastelands of Lapland, audiences were not simply watching an action hero, they were witnessing a symbol, an embodiment of a Finnish cultural idea, Sisu, an untranslatable essence of grit, endurance, and the refusal to yield. The sequel deepens this by grounding it in something more personal, more vulnerable, and more human, the memory of the family he lost and the home that was once a sanctuary before it became a graveyard. The film opens in silence, a silence that carries the weight of seasons and the echoes of memories that never left the battlefield. Atami dismantles what remains of his old home, plank by plank, as if performing a ritual that honors the dead while freeing the living. Every wooden beam he lifts is heavy with emotion, yet his expression remains impassive, worn by decades of violence that hardened him beyond the reach of outward grief. The simple act of loading the pieces of his ruined home onto a truck becomes a metaphor for the internal world he carries, a world broken, yet not surrendered. In this sequel, the filmmakers shift their focus toward exploring what remains of a man after he has lost everything and what compels him to continue walking forward in a world that has done nothing but take. When Atami begins the journey to move the remnants of his home to a new place, he is not running from the past, he is dragging it with him, determined to reshape it into something that still holds meaning. This thread of reconstruction, physical and emotional, runs through the film with sharp clarity. Yet the world he tries to escape refuses to loosen its hold. The re-emergence of Igor Dragunov, a Red Army commander whose cruelty carved the deepest wounds in Atami's life, tears open history in a way that feels personal even before the first confrontation. Dragunov is not simply a villain, he is a remnant of a war that refuses to stay buried, a living embodiment of the violence that destroyed Atami's family and transformed him into the hardened figure audiences came to know. Stephen Lang brings a chilling presence to Dragunov, imbuing him with a cold arrogance that contrasts starkly with Atami's quiet resolve. Dragunov relishes cruelty, treating war as a stage for domination. Atami endures war like a punishment he was forced to accept. Their philosophies clash long before their bodies do, and the tension between them vibrates across every encounter. As the story unfolds, the landscape becomes a character in itself. Vast forests, abandoned outposts, frozen lakes, and battered roads stretch endlessly across the screen, emphasizing the isolation of a world still wounded from conflict. The cinematography brings these spaces to life with brutal honesty. The cold air bites, the mud clings, and the harsh winds feel like nature's own judgment. The journey becomes a relentless chase through terrain that amplifies the brutality of every fight. The action sequences, though spectacular, never lose their grounded weight. Every explosion, every blade, every bullet carries impact because the film refuses to glamorize violence. It shows violence as a language spoken by men shaped by war, where mercy is rare and survival is fragile. Atami's skill in combat feels almost mythical, yet the film never lets the audience forget the human cost etched into his body. The scars we don't see weigh as heavily as the ones we do. At the same time, the choreography leans into a distinct stylistic flair, an exaggerated physicality reminiscent of silent-era performers blended with modern action energy. The result is a film that balances gritty realism with cinematic spectacle, keeping the audience anchored in the story while still delivering scenes that feel larger than life. As the conflict intensifies, Atami becomes less a man seeking revenge and more an elemental force moved by grief and memory. His pursuit of Dragunov is not a hunt born from fury but a necessity rooted in closure. Where the first film centered around survival against overwhelming odds, the sequel explores what a man does when he survives long enough to confront the ghosts that shaped him. The supporting cast amplifies this thematic arc. particularly the presence of Richard Brake as a KGB officer who commands Dragunov with bureaucratic menace. His cold instructions remind the audience that the war machine is impersonal, uncaring, and relentless. In contrast, Atami's actions revolve around personal meaning, honor, loss, memory, and the reconstruction of a past that can never fully return. As the chase stretches across miles, both men begin to unravel. Dragunov becomes increasingly erratic, driven by obsession rather than military duty. Atami becomes increasingly focused, his silence sharpening into something formidable. Their inevitable confrontation is not a simple clash of strength but a collision of pasts that could never coexist. The final act of the film carries a sense of inevitability, not because the outcome is predictable, but because the emotional momentum demands resolution. When Atami and Dragunov face each other for the last time, it does not feel like hero versus villain, it feels like two broken remnants of a shattered era finally reaching the end of a road that has tormented them both. The brutality of their final battle is layered with the emotional weight of everything that came before. It is cathartic, painful, and strangely poetic. And when the dust settles, Atami does not claim triumph. He claims peace, small, quiet, and fragile, like the flicker of a candle in the wind. But for a man who has known nothing but storm, even a fragile flame is a victory. The aftermath returns to the symbolism of home. Atami's reconstruction of his disassembled house becomes a metaphor for the rebuilding of a life that war tried to erase. It is not portrayed as a grand triumph but as a humble act of resilience. The film closes not with declarations of victory but with a sense of continuation. The past is not erased, but it is finally laid to rest. The story of Sisu, Road to Revenge resonates beyond its genre because it intertwines raw action with human vulnerability. It uses violence not as entertainment but as storytelling, showing how deeply conflict carves into the soul. It respects the emotional silence of its protagonist and allows his story to unfold not through dialogue but through action, expression, and the quiet dignity of endurance. The film stands as a testament to the idea that heroism is not loud or boastful, it is the quiet refusal to surrender to despair. Atami embodies this with every breath, every step, and every blow he delivers. What he seeks is not glory or revenge but the right to build something meaningful again, a right that war took from him yet could never fully extinguish. The sequel expands the universe of Sisu not by making it bigger but by digging deeper, exploring the emotional roots of a character who captivated audiences through silence and resilience. It adds layers to his legend without diluting the mystery that defines him. And in doing so, it elevates the film from a simple action piece to a story about humanity, memory, endurance, and the eternal struggle to reclaim pieces of oneself after unimaginable loss. What remains at the end is an image of a man who has survived everything except the memory of what he loved. And yet, in a world scarred by violence, he chooses to rebuild. That choice is the true heart of the film, and the ultimate expression of Sisu. What makes Sisu, Road to Revenge particularly striking is the way it reframes the very concept of strength. In many action films, strength is measured by victory, by the number of enemies defeated, or by the spectacle of destruction. But here, strength becomes something quieter, something internal, something forged in the spaces between violence rather than in the violence itself. The film consistently returns to moments where movement pauses, where breath becomes visible in the frozen air, and where Atami stands alone against a landscape that neither cares nor sympathizes. These moments redefine heroism not as domination but as endurance, the kind of endurance that refuses to die even when everything else has. Each frame seems built to remind the audience that true power is not always loud or explosive, sometimes it grows in silence, in the willingness to continue even when the world has been reduced to ashes. The emotional architecture of the film rests heavily on memory, not through flashbacks or dialogue, but through the physicality of objects and spaces. Atami's home, before it is dismantled, sits as a monument to the life he once lived. Its charred wood remembers the fire that consumed his family. Its foundations hold echoes of laughter that once filled its walls. By choosing to take the house with him board by board, Atami does not cling to the past in a desperate attempt to revive it. Instead, he honors it by refusing to let war dictate what remains and what disappears. This act of preservation is rooted not in nostalgia but in defiance of the forces that tried to erase everything he loved. The film understands that trauma is not a wound that simply fades, it becomes a landscape within a person, shaping every decision, every breath, and every hope that struggles to survive. The way the film navigates emotion is especially notable because Atami himself is a character of few words. Dialogue is sparse, but expression is constant. His silence carries the weight of 1,000 stories. The filmmakers allow his face, his movements, and the worn texture of his hands to communicate experiences that language could never capture. When he rebuilds his home, his motions are careful but strained, revealing the toll of carrying so much loss for so long. When he prepares for battle, the tension in his posture conveys not excitement but a grim understanding of what must be done. This nuanced portrayal respects the intelligence of the audience, trusting them to see meaning in the spaces between words. The antagonist, Igor Dragunov, functions not just as a threat but as a mirror, reflecting everything Atami might have become if he had surrendered to the darkness that consumed his life. Dragunov embodies cruelty without restraint, violence without purpose, and authority without conscience. He represents the kind of man shaped entirely by power, thriving in chaos because it amplifies his control. His return in the sequel is not merely a plot device but a psychological confrontation with the past. His presence forces Atami to face the final chapter of his grief, the one ghost he never truly confronted. While Atami rebuilt his life from ruins, Dragunov remained trapped in the role of a war predator, never evolving, never growing, never understanding the cost of the violence he inflicted. This contrast between them adds depth to every encounter, turning their conflict into more than a simple clash of enemies, it becomes a confrontation between two ways of surviving war. As the narrative progresses, the world they traverse seems designed to test them both. Abandoned barracks, derelict vehicles frozen in ice, fields still scarred by bomb craters, each environment feels haunted, not by ghosts, but by the remnants of war itself. The production design uses these spaces to evoke a sense of desolation that lingers long after the battles are over. They are reminders that war leaves traces not just on bodies and memories, but on the very land where it was fought. These landscapes challenge Atami physically and psychologically, pushing him toward a confrontation he did not seek yet cannot avoid. The harshness of the terrain enhances the realism of the action sequences, giving each physical struggle a level of authenticity that prevents the film from drifting into stylized fantasy. The action choreography, though visceral and relentless, never loses its sense of character. Atami fights like a man who has learned violence not through training alone but through necessity. His strikes are decisive, efficient, and devoid of flourish. Every movement seems tailored to survival, not spectacle. In contrast, Dragunov's men often fight with arrogance and recklessness, confident in their numbers and weapons. This difference becomes a storytelling device that highlights the philosophical divide between them. Atami does not kill for dominance or cruelty, he kills because the path to justice demands it. The film ensures that the audience remains aware of the psychological stakes behind every fight, preventing action from becoming hollow entertainment. Furthermore, the emotional intensity of the film builds not only through conflict but through the quiet moments that punctuate it. These are found in scenes where Atami pauses to inspect a fragment of wood from his house, or where he stops to gaze across an empty field that once echoed with the footsteps of soldiers. These pauses remind the audience that amidst the chaos of war, moments of reflection are what keep humanity intact. They deepen our understanding of Atami's motives, revealing that revenge is not his goal, closure is. He does not hunt Dragunov out of hatred, but because justice has never been served, and because the ghosts of his past will never rest until the man who destroyed his life is gone. The film culminates in a finale that merges physical intensity with emotional resolution. The final confrontation between Atami and Dragunov feels inevitable, not because the narrative demands it, but because the characters themselves cannot exist in the same world without settling the past. When they fight, it feels less like a battle between two men and more like a collision of everything they represent: grief against cruelty, endurance against domination, memory against oblivion. The outcome is brutally earned, and when the dust clears, it becomes apparent that the victory is not over Dragunov alone but over the internal torment that Atami has carried for years. When the film returns to the image of Atami rebuilding his home, the significance becomes clear. He is not seeking to recreate what once was, because he knows the past cannot return. Instead, he is building a foundation for a life that can finally move forward. It is an act of rebirth, quiet but powerful, representing a choice to live in a world where he is no longer defined by loss alone. The simplicity of this final image speaks louder than any dialogue could. It is a reminder that healing does not come in moments of triumph but in the small, steady acts of rebuilding after destruction. Sisu, Road to Revenge grows beyond the boundaries of a traditional action narrative by weaving emotional complexity into its brutal exterior. It becomes a meditation on resilience, a tribute to the unbreakable spirit of a man who has every reason to fall but chooses to stand again. The film acknowledges the cost of survival without reducing it to tragedy. Instead, it elevates survival into an expression of purpose, identity, and defiance against a world that tried to erase everything meaningful. In Atami's journey, the audience witnesses not just a fight for justice but a fight for the right to remember, to rebuild, and to reclaim a sense of self in a world scarred by war. The film's lasting impact comes from this balance between violence and vulnerability, destruction and reconstruction, grief and hope. And because of this balance, the story of Sisu grows beyond cinema into something almost mythic, a timeless tale of a man who refused to let the darkness that consumed his world extinguish the light that still lived within him. What becomes increasingly clear as the story unfolds is that Sisu, Road to Revenge is not simply about the violence of war but about the psychological landscape left behind when the war is over. Atami Korpi moves through a world that appears silent on the surface, yet beneath that silence lies the hum of unresolved trauma, the quiet anguish of men who survived the unthinkable but were never given the chance to rebuild what they lost. The film understands that survival is not the end of suffering, it is the beginning of a different kind of battle, one fought internally, without witnesses, where victories are intangible and losses are deeply personal. When Atami travels with the pieces of his dismantled home loaded behind him, the symbolism becomes impossible to ignore. He is not carrying lumber, he is carrying memory. He is hauling the weight of every moment that defined him, as if refusing to abandon the fragments of a life that once gave him purpose. The truck rumbling across barren stretches of land feels like a pilgrimage through grief, a journey neither toward the future nor away from the past, but into a space where both can coexist. Along the way, the film gives brief glimpses into the remnants of wartime cruelty still lingering in the environment. Burnt-out buildings, rusting machinery, and forgotten bones serve as a reminder that time does not erase human suffering, it merely hides it beneath layers of soil and silence. The cinematography leans into this, framing Atami as a solitary figure dwarfed by landscapes scarred by violence. His smallness within the frame does not diminish him, instead, it amplifies the enormity of the world's wounds. In these moments, the film suggests that reconstruction, whether of a home or a soul, is always dwarfed by the destruction that preceded it. Yet it is the attempt to rebuild that gives meaning to survival. Dragunov's pursuit of Atami reflects a man unable to grasp this truth. His motivations are steeped in ego, vengeance, and a desperate need to reassert dominance in a world where his relevance is slipping away. War empowered him, gave him purpose, gave him a throne built from fear. Peace, however fragile, strips men like him of the identity forged in violence. His return is fueled not only by cruelty but by confusion, a man who only knows how to exist in chaos seeking to recreate it as a way of reclaiming himself. In this sense, Dragunov is not only chasing Atami, he is chasing the past, trying to reignite a fire that history has begun to smother. This dynamic transforms their conflict from a simple battle into a thematic clash between two forms of survival, one that seeks meaning through rebuilding, and one that seeks significance through destruction. As the chase continues, the pacing of the film tightens, each sequence more intense than the last, blending moments of raw physical struggle with cinematic flourishes that elevate the action without sacrificing realism. The physicality of the performances is palpable. Atami's movements carry the weight of age and experience, every strike he delivers is deliberate, every defense carefully measured. Dragunov's men often underestimate him, mistaking silence for weakness, only to discover too late that his restraint is not a limitation but a disciplined focus sharpened by years of living on the edge of death. These confrontations highlight the fundamental difference between men shaped by necessity and those shaped by entitlement. Atami does not seek conflict, but he does not hesitate when confronted by it. Dragunov's men, however, view violence as a game, a performance, or a demonstration of power. In the end, these contrasting philosophies determine their fates. As the film approaches its final confrontation, the emotional tension reaches a point where action and meaning become inseparable. The brutality of the fight is not choreographed for entertainment, it is crafted to reveal the final layer of Atami's journey. Every blow exchanged between the two men feels like an exorcism of everything that has haunted them. When Atami finally gains the upper hand, it is not triumph that registers on his face, it is exhaustion, relief, and a deep, quiet sorrow. He understands that killing Dragunov does not resurrect his family or restore what was taken. It merely ends a chapter that has been open for far too long. And in that closure, he finds a space where healing can finally begin. After the violence subsides, the film softens its tone, returning to the theme of rebuilding with renewed significance. The remnants of Atami's home, once symbols of grief, now become symbols of possibility. As he begins the slow process of reconstructing it, the audience witnesses a transformation, not of grand emotional gestures, but of small, deliberate steps toward a life that he can claim as his own. The quietness of these scenes is intentional. It reflects the truth that healing rarely comes with fanfare. It emerges in the calm after the storm, in the steady rhythm of work done with purpose, and in the acceptance that the past, while painful, does not have to dictate the present. The ending lingers long after the credits because it refuses to deliver easy answers. It acknowledges that some wounds never fully heal, and some losses remain permanent. But it also affirms that even in the shadow of tremendous suffering, resilience is possible. Atami's journey becomes a testament to the capacity of the human spirit to withstand unimaginable pain and still choose to build something meaningful. The sequel extends the legacy of the first film by exploring not just how a man survives violence, but how he lives after it. This depth is what elevates Sisu, Road to Revenge beyond the boundaries of genre. It becomes a story that resonates with universal themes of endurance, memory, justice, and the fragile, unwavering hope that the future, though scarred, can still hold something worth living for. What follows in the emotional undercurrent of Sisu, Road to Revenge is a profound exploration of what it means to reclaim one's humanity after it has been battered, mutilated, and reshaped by war. Atami's silence throughout the film functions almost as a spiritual discipline, a way of maintaining control in a world where control is constantly under threat. His refusal to speak is not an absence of expression but a form of mastery, as if language itself is too fragile, too vulnerable to hold the enormity of what he has endured. In this silence, he becomes more than a man, he becomes an embodiment of endurance, a living metaphor for the countless individuals whose stories of suffering were lost in the noise of conflict. The film captures this with precision, allowing his quiet presence to speak volumes where dialogue would have diminished the gravity of his journey. As the narrative stretches forward, the filmmakers expand the emotional palette through the environment itself. The shifting landscapes, stretches of frozen wilderness giving way to forests, abandoned roads, and battle-scarred ruins, mirror the internal transformation taking place within Atami. Each new terrain brings with it a different emotional resonance. The icy plains represent isolation and the stillness of grief. Forested regions reflect confusion and danger, where shadows move like memories that refuse to stay buried. The shattered remains of wartime structures symbolize the lingering trauma of a world that has not yet fully awakened from its violent past. Atami navigates these environments with a stoic determination that suggests he is not merely traveling across physical space but moving through the emotional remnants of his life. This journey is intercut with moments that reveal the profound disconnect between Atami and the men who pursue him. Dragunov's soldiers operate under the illusion that their authority is absolute, that weapons and numbers give them an upper hand in a world where fear once commanded obedience. They fail to understand that Atami long ago ceased to fear anything that breathes. Their bravado, often expressed through careless cruelty and mocking confidence, underscores their inability to perceive the depth of his will. This narrative contrast becomes a recurring thematic device. Those who mistake external power for true strength inevitably crumble when confronted with someone who has built strength from within. Dragunov himself embodies a more insidious form of fragility. Beneath his ruthlessness lies insecurity, a fear of irrelevance as the war that once crowned him with authority fades into history. Each decision he makes throughout the film is fueled not by strategy but by desperation. His pursuit of Atami becomes an attempt to recapture the sense of power he once wielded so effortlessly. This psychological unraveling is depicted with subtlety, as Stephen Lang delivers a performance layered with barely disguised mania, a man clinging to authority as it slips through his fingers. By positioning Dragunov as both predator and victim of his own internal decay, the film elevates their conflict beyond a simple revenge narrative, transforming it into a symbolic clash between two very different relationships to suffering. The emotional crescendo of the film builds slowly, like pressure beneath ice, until it finally erupts in a sequence that is both physically brutal and emotionally charged. The confrontation between Atami and Dragunov is not staged for spectacle but for catharsis. Every movement they make seems weighted with the history they share, the loss, the cruelty, the irreversible damage. The choreography reflects this emotional density, with each strike, each block, each step forward echoing the unspoken truths between them. This is not merely a fight between two men, it is a resolution to a story that began long before the events of the first film. It is the only ending that could exist, not out of narrative convenience but out of emotional necessity. When the dust settles and silence returns, the film enters its most reflective phase. The violence fades, replaced by a quietness that feels almost sacred. Atami stands not as a victorious warrior but as a survivor confronting the emptiness left behind. Instead of celebrating his triumph, the film shows him turning back to the fragments of his home, the pieces he carried across a battlefield of memories. He begins to rebuild, not with joy, but with resolve. This reconstruction resonates on multiple levels. It symbolizes his attempt to claim a life beyond violence. It honors the memory of what was lost without clinging to despair. And it represents the slow, painful process of healing that follows trauma. There is a beauty in the film's refusal to romanticize this rebuilding. The process is shown as laborious, quiet, and imperfect, just as healing is. Atami is not restored to a state of peace simply because Dragunov is gone. Instead, he takes the first difficult steps toward a future that does not erase the past but integrates it. In these scenes, the film achieves a poetic resonance that transcends genre, speaking to universal truths about survival and recovery. Sisu, Road to Revenge ultimately becomes a meditation on identity in the aftermath of destruction. Atami's strength does not come from invulnerability or violence but from the choice to carry on when there is no rational reason to do so. His resilience is not the dramatic resilience of a hero triumphant but the quiet endurance of a man who understands that life, even at its most fragile, is worth protecting. The film approaches this theme with a philosophical depth rarely seen in action cinema, portraying survival not as a victory but as a responsibility. This responsibility is reflected in every frame of the final sequences. The audience is invited to witness a kind of rebirth, not of a man, but of purpose. Atami's reconstruction of his home becomes a ritual of rehumanization, a reclaiming of the right to exist in a world that tried to erase him. His journey teaches that the true triumph of the human spirit lies not in defeating enemies but in choosing to rebuild after the enemies are gone. The film leaves the audience not with the exhilaration of victory but with the solemnity of understanding, the quiet awareness that healing is its own form of heroism. And in the end, the legend of Atami Korpi continues not because he is invincible, but because he is unstoppable, an embodiment of Sisu in its purest form, a testament to the resilience that defines the human condition even in its darkest hours. What unfolds beyond those final quiet moments of reconstruction is a deeper examination of how a man like Atami re-enters a world that has grown unfamiliar to him. The film hints subtly that survival after immense trauma often creates a disconnect between the survivor and the society that emerges after the violence is gone. People rebuild, cities heal, nations move on, but individuals carry the echoes of what they experienced far longer than the world around them acknowledges. Atami becomes a symbol of this phenomenon, a man standing in the present but shaped entirely by a past that refuses to loosen its grip. His homecoming is not marked by celebration or recognition, it is marked by introspection, by an awareness that the life he is returning to is forever altered. The painstaking process of reconstructing his home reveals the emotional truth that the past cannot be restored exactly as it was. The wood may be the same, the land may be the same, but the man building upon it has changed. In every swing of the hammer, every placement of a board, there is a quiet acknowledgement that what once stood there is now a memory, and what he builds now is not an attempt to recapture the old world but to create something that honors it. The camera lingers on these moments, allowing the viewer to feel the weight of what it means to rebuild while fully aware of the emptiness that lingers in the spaces memory used to fill. These scenes carry a poetic melancholy, an emotional language spoken not in words but in gestures, in silence, in the slow rhythm of work guided by both grief and resolve. This new phase of Atami's life is portrayed not as an ending but as an evolution. The filmmakers choose not to present a man healed or whole but a man who finally understands the necessity of moving forward. The trauma that shaped him will always be part of his identity, but it will no longer dictate every step he takes. This concept is subtly explored through the environment changing around him. The colors soften, the light grows warmer, nature begins to reclaim the land around his home. There is an unspoken idea that healing is not a sudden transformation but a gradual alignment between the internal and the external world. As Atami rebuilds, the world rebuilds with him, not through dramatic signs, but through the small shifts in atmosphere that reflect a new beginning. The film's emotional resonance deepens when it becomes clear that Atami's struggle is not just a personal journey but a representation of countless others who return from war with invisible wounds. The story uses his silence as a metaphor for the many people who could not articulate what they had endured. In a way, Atami carries the stories of all of them, the ones who survived, the ones who did not, the ones who tried to rebuild but couldn't. His endurance becomes a tribute to their memory. This universal significance gives the film a weight that lingers long after it ends. The audience begins to understand that the story is not simply about revenge or resilience. It is about the cost of violence on the human soul and the grace required to continue living despite it. What the filmmakers accomplish is a nuanced portrayal of masculinity stripped of bravado. Atami's strength does not come from dominance, aggression, or physical prowess, although he possesses all three. His strength emerges from his ability to withstand despair without succumbing to it. It comes from his capacity to live without demanding recognition, from his devotion to the simple but profound act of rebuilding. In this, the film challenges the conventional image of a warrior. It argues that true heroism lies not in the battles won but in the quiet courage it takes to rebuild a life from ruins, to choose creation over destruction in a world that has taught you only how to fight. There is a moment near the end, subtle, almost unnoticeable, where Atami pauses in his work and looks out across the land. The camera holds the shot, giving space for the audience to interpret what he might be thinking. It could be sorrow. It could be peace. It could be a memory resurfacing before settling back into silence. What makes the moment powerful is not knowing exactly what passes through his mind but feeling the weight of everything he has carried to reach this point. It is a reminder that healing is not linear, that moments of reflection often arrive unexpectedly, bringing with them both pain and understanding. The film trusts the audience enough to let this moment breathe, resisting the urge to explain or embellish, knowing the power lies in its ambiguity. This ambiguity extends to the future as well. The final sequences do not offer a clear resolution about what lies ahead for Atami. They do not promise happiness, nor do they suggest further conflict. Instead, they offer possibility. The possibility of a life shaped not by survival alone but by purpose. The possibility of peace, not the absence of suffering, but the acceptance of it. The possibility that even after the worst chapters of life have ended, something meaningful can still be written. The film leaves these possibilities open, allowing the audience to imagine the next steps while understanding that whatever comes, Atami will face it with the same unyielding spirit that carried him through the darkest hours. In this sense, Sisu, Road to Revenge evolves beyond its narrative of conflict and into a meditation on resilience, grief, and the profound human need to build something enduring out of the fragments left behind. It becomes a story about the dignity of survival, the complexity of healing, and the quiet, unwavering force that drives a person to keep going when the world has given them every reason to stop. As the final frame fades, the legacy of Atami Korpi is no longer defined by the violence he endured or the enemies he defeated but by the life he chooses to rebuild in the aftermath, a life forged from endurance, shaped by memory, and sustained by the quiet, unbreakable power of Sisu itself. As time begins to settle into the newly carved rhythms of Atami's life, the film subtly reveals a deeper layer of internal struggle that transcends the mechanics of rebuilding. It is the battle every survivor eventually faces, the fight to reclaim parts of themselves they once believed were lost forever. In the early days of reconstruction, Atami's movements feel almost mechanical, driven more by habit than intention. But gradually, the work begins to anchor him in the present. Each board he raises, each nail he drives, each wall that slowly forms carries with it a fragment of renewal, as if the act of creation is slowly stitching together the frayed edges of a soul long torn by violence. And yet, beneath this progress lies a quiet question, one he never voices but that the film gently suggests through lingering shots and silent pauses: who is Atami without the war, without the fight, without the relentless force of survival pushing him forward? The narrative shifts its emotional tone by focusing on these internal transitions. There is a heaviness in the realization that a life defined by conflict leaves behind a hollowness once the conflict is gone. Many stories romanticize the return to peace, but Sisu, Road to Revenge dares to explore the uncomfortable truth that peace can be as daunting as war for someone who no longer remembers who they were before. The stillness becomes its own kind of battlefield, one where the enemies are memories, regrets, and the unsettling quiet of days that no longer demand violence. The film does not portray this as weakness but as a natural result of enduring something profoundly inhuman. It acknowledges that recovery is as much a confrontation as any fight Atami has faced. This introspective layer takes on greater weight through the environment around him. Nature begins to reclaim the land, shrubs growing where shells once fell, animals returning cautiously to spaces that were abandoned during the conflict. These details are not simply aesthetic flourishes, they carry symbolic resonance. The land and its creatures heal at their own pace, just as Atami must. His presence in this recovering landscape creates a visual conversation between man and nature, as if both are learning to breathe again after holding their breath for far too long. Sometimes the wind carries echoes of the past, stirring the trees in ways that seem almost reminiscent of distant gunfire, and Atami pauses, listening, not out of fear, but out of habit. Slowly, those pauses lessen, suggesting a gradual rewiring of instinct, a slow return to a state of being where danger no longer lurks behind every sound. The film deepens this emotional journey by allowing moments of memory to surface not as flashbacks, but as sensory impressions. A quiet evening might bring the faint memory of laughter, the echo of a family once alive. A sunset might trigger the recollection of a long-forgotten tenderness. The filmmakers understand that memory rarely arrives in full scenes, it comes in fragments, in moments, in sensations that seep into the present unexpectedly. These small intrusions form the emotional backbone of Atami's evolution. He does not chase these memories, nor does he flee them. He accepts them as part of who he is. They are not weapons anymore, they are reminders of the life he is trying to rebuild. What becomes increasingly powerful is the way the film contrasts Atami's quiet transformation with the world around him cautiously rebuilding its own identity after the war. Villages begin to show signs of life again. People repair roofs, till soil, engage in small acts of normalcy that once felt impossible. Though Atami remains physically removed from them, the presence of human resilience in the distance creates a sense of collective healing. The world is moving forward, and Atami, even in his isolation, becomes part of that movement. His solitude is not portrayed as loneliness but as a necessary phase, one that allows him to process his past without being overwhelmed by the expectations of others. As the film progresses into this deeper emotional territory, Atami's character begins to show subtle but significant shifts. His body, once coiled with survival instinct, grows more relaxed. His eyes, which once scanned each horizon with caution, begin to absorb the world more fully. There is a quiet moment where he sees birds building a nest in the branches of a nearby tree, a simple, everyday occurrence, yet the film treats it with reverence. For the first time, Atami allows himself to watch without urgency, without suspicion, without the weight of the past anchoring his gaze. It is a moment so ordinary that it becomes extraordinary in the context of his journey. In that small observation lies the profound idea that life, in all its fragility, continues not because it forgets hardship, but because it persists through it. The filmmakers extend these themes by exploring the notion that identity after trauma is not about returning to who one was but about discovering who one can become. Atami's identity, once defined by war's brutality, begins to shift towards something quieter, something softer, though never weak. The strength at the core of his character remains, but its expression changes. It no longer manifests in violence or adrenaline but in commitment, patience, and the deliberate crafting of a new beginning. This transformation is not dramatic or overt, it unfolds slowly, like dawn breaking across a horizon that has been dark for too long. There is a powerful sense that the world he is rebuilding is not merely a structure of wood and stone but a sanctuary for the parts of himself that long ago shut down for survival's sake. The film's pacing deliberately slows during this period, allowing the audience to witness the beauty in progress, in the rebuilding of a life one piece at a time. The absence of dialogue heightens the emotional resonance, transforming every gesture into a statement of intent and every breath into a testament of endurance. By this point, the film steps quietly into a thematic space rarely addressed with such subtlety, the sacredness of survival. Not the dramatic survival of epic battles or heroic last stands, but the ordinary survival of waking up after a nightmare and choosing to live another day. Atami's journey becomes an ode to this kind of survival, the kind that often goes unnoticed but carries the deepest form of courage. His story reveals that sometimes the most profound act of defiance is not the destruction of an enemy but the creation of a life worth existing in. And as his home gradually rises from the ashes of memory, the film implies that this act of creation is not just for him. It is a tribute to those who cannot rebuild, a promise to those he lost, a living monument to resilience itself. He builds because they cannot. He continues because they no longer can. The home becomes an embodiment of love, pain, memory, and hope, a structure shaped by hands that have known both tenderness and unimaginable violence. Through this, Sisu, Road to Revenge reaches its emotional peak, the realization that the greatest revenge against a world that tried to destroy him is not violence, but survival. Not rage, but rebuilding. Not death, but the quiet insistence on life. As Atami settles into the rhythm of rebuilding, the film begins to illuminate the quieter, almost invisible weight that rests on a survivor's shoulders, the weight of existing between two worlds. One is the world he came from, filled with ghosts, violence, and memories etched into his bones. The other is the world he is trying to enter, one defined by calm, routine, and the slow return of ordinariness. The conflict between these worlds is not dramatic but internal, playing out in the smallest gestures and briefest moments of hesitation. Atami finds himself pausing in the middle of tasks, his mind momentarily caught in echoes of the past before returning to the present. These subtle fractures in his focus reveal that survival is not a clean break from trauma but a constant negotiation with it. As days pass, the soundtrack of his life changes. Where once the only sounds were the harsh rhythms of conflict, now the world offers gentler noises, the rustling of trees, the distant calls of wildlife, the whisper of wind sliding through open spaces. These sounds, though calming, initially feel foreign to him, as if they belong to someone else's world. But the film is patient with this transition, letting the auditory landscape gradually become familiar, a kind of healing music that replaces the silence of grief. It is only when Atami unconsciously aligns his movements with these natural sounds that the audience realizes he is slowly reconnecting to a world that exists beyond survival. During this period, the camera begins to observe him differently. Earlier, his movements were framed with tension, as though the world itself was watching a man forever on the edge of combat. Now the camera lingers longer, inviting the viewer not to witness danger but to witness presence. It follows the slight shift in his posture as he relaxes near a fire, the way his shoulders lower when he looks at the horizon, the faint exhale that carries with it a release of something burdened inside him. These visual cues suggest that healing doesn't explode into being, it emerges gradually, almost invisibly, through moments so small they could be mistaken for nothing at all. One such moment occurs when he finds an old object buried beneath the soil, perhaps a remnant from his previous life, something worn, half-rotted, yet still carrying a memory within it. He lifts it with a tenderness that contrasts sharply with the brutal strength he displayed in battle. For the first time, the audience sees vulnerability not as a weakness but as evidence of humanity he has spent years protecting under the armor of survival. This single moment becomes a turning point not because of what he does with the object, but because of what it reveals, that he is finally allowing himself to feel again, even if only cautiously. As the reconstruction nears its midpoint, Atami's internal world begins to develop a quiet duality. Part of him remains tethered to the memory of everything he's lost, the pain that shaped him into a figure of near-mythic resilience. But another part begins to grow, small, fragile, but persistent. This emerging part of him is not defined by war but by possibility. The possibility of peace. The possibility of a life not ruled by instinct. The possibility of rediscovering human connection, even if he doubts he deserves it. The film deepens this emotional evolution by allowing nature to become an extension of Atami's psyche. As his home slowly takes shape, the environment around it changes too. Sunlight begins to filter through the trees with a different warmth, as if the world recognizes the sanctuary he is creating. Grass shoots up through soil long crushed by conflict, and the land begins to heal in tandem with its most wounded inhabitant. There is a subtle harmony in these parallel arcs of restoration, a reminder that both land and people carry scars, and both possess the capacity to regenerate. Still, the film refuses to oversimplify this path forward. Healing is never linear. There are nights when old instincts surge unexpectedly, moments when Atami wakes from sleep with the reflex of a soldier, his breath harsh, his eyes scanning the darkness for threats that no longer exist. These scenes are not presented as setbacks but as truths every survivor carries, moments that must be lived through rather than conquered. The film honors these moments with honesty, portraying trauma not as something that disappears, but as something that gradually softens under the weight of time and intention. Over time, Atami's body language evolves. He moves less like a man expecting violence and more like a man performing rituals of belonging, a man who stakes his claim not through force, but through care. He mends a doorframe with precise, almost meditative patience. He gathers stones for a foundation with the deliberateness of someone anchoring himself to the land. He prepares a simple meal using methods long forgotten but remembered through muscle memory. These acts, quiet, unremarkable to an outsider, carry an immense weight because they reveal a transition from existence to living. And in this quiet living, something shifts within him, a recognition that rebuilding is not merely about replacing what was lost but about accepting the responsibility of moving forward. The home he builds is more than shelter, it is a declaration that his story does not end in violence. It is a testament to those he lost, a vow that their memory will live through the life he chooses to create rather than the battles he was forced to fight. This is the moment the filmmakers allow the concept of Sisu to fully unfold, not as brute endurance, not as violent resilience, but as the deep, spiritual courage to keep walking toward life even when the road is built on shattered ground. Atami embodies this not through dramatic gestures but through the simple insistence that he still exists, still breathes, still creates, still chooses to live. As the film moves deeper into this emotional terrain, the audience begins to see that the true heart of the story is not revenge, not survival, not even resilience, but transformation. A transformation that happens slowly, silently, without fanfare, yet powerful enough to redefine a man once shaped entirely by tragedy. As Atami continues to inhabit the space he is rebuilding, the film begins to illuminate an even deeper layer of his transformation, the gradual reconciliation between the man he became during the war and the man he once was before it. This reconciliation does not happen in dramatic moments or sudden revelations. It unfolds in the quiet spaces between tasks, in the pauses where he allows himself to simply be rather than do. These small moments of stillness are where the film reveals its most affecting truth, that healing often occurs not in action but in the quiet acceptance of all the versions of oneself that coexist within. There are scenes where Atami sits at the edge of the rebuilt structure, staring into the distance as if measuring the depth of the world spread out before him. His posture is no longer defensive, no longer tight with readiness. Instead, his body begins to take on the shape of someone learning to trust stillness again. For a man who once lived by anticipating danger, this trust is a profound emotional breakthrough. The silence surrounding him becomes a companion rather than a threat, a space where he can breathe without the reflexive need to prepare for violence. In this silence, the film allows the audience to sense the slow unraveling of the internal knots that wore tied so tightly. As he works, memories arrive less painfully. They no longer seize him with the sharpness of a wound but emerge with the gentle ache of remembrance. The film never shows these memories outright, yet the audience feels their presence through the subtle shifts in Atami's eyes, the faint softening of his features, the tender way he touches a piece of wood or stone as if handling something sacred. These gestures convey that the past, once an unbearable weight, is beginning to integrate into the person he is becoming. He is not trying to forget, he is learning to carry memory without letting it crush him. This emotional evolution is reinforced through the changing rhythm of his days. Tasks that once felt heavy now carry a quiet sense of purpose. The reconstruction of his home no longer appears simply as work, it becomes ritual, something sacred, something meditative. Each motion is deliberate, each choice intentional, as though he is not merely building a structure but weaving together the strands of his spirit. The home becomes less a place to live and more a manifestation of his recovery, a physical form shaped by the slow, patient return of meaning. As the seasons begin to shift around him, the film subtly mirrors this internal transformation through the environment's gradual renewal. The air grows warmer. The nights soften. New shoots of green emerge in the soil. Nature, like Atami, is reclaiming itself piece by piece. This shared journey between man and land gives the story a poetic resonance, suggesting that healing is not something he does alone, it is something the world participates in with him. The landscape, once scarred, begins to glow with subtle signs of rebirth, as though acknowledging his efforts and offering solace in return. But the film is honest enough to show that renewal does not erase pain. There are evenings when the shadows grow long and the memories return with a sharpness that catches him off guard. These moments remind the audience that trauma is not something conquered once and for all, it resurfaces in waves, reclaiming space within the psyche before receding again. During these moments, Atami sits quietly, allowing the memories to wash over him. He does not fight them, nor does he surrender to them. Instead, he witnesses them. This act of witnessing becomes a form of mastery more profound than any victory on the battlefield. It is the acceptance that pain is part of who he is but no longer defines every breath he takes. One of the most intimate glimpses into Atami's evolving emotional landscape occurs when he begins to use objects from his past not as relics of grief but as elements of his new home. Perhaps a piece of furniture that survived the fire becomes integrated into his new space. Perhaps a tool once used in happier times finds its place again on his wall. These small acts signal an important shift. He is no longer running from the past, nor is he trapped by it. He is incorporating it into his present, allowing memory to coexist with possibility. This synthesis becomes one of the film's deepest emotional victories. Atami's hands, so often instruments of destruction, begin to symbolize creation once again. They cut wood, lift beams, shape the home with a grace that contrasts profoundly with the violence they once wielded. The camera pays special attention to his hands during this phase, lingering on them as if acknowledging their dual history. These hands have taken life, saved life, lost life. Now they build life. This evolution is not spoken aloud, but it resonates deeply through the visual language of the film, offering a powerful meditation on the human capacity for transformation. It is during these quiet stretches of work that hints of an inner peace begin to appear, tentative, fragile, but unmistakable. Peace, for Atami, does not mean the absence of hardship. It means the presence of moments where he can exist without the burden of constant defense. It means the first small stirrings of a life shaped by intention rather than reaction. It means allowing himself a future. As the days extend and the structure grows, the film begins to reveal that Atami's greatest battle is not with an enemy but with the idea that he deserves to live in a world not defined by suffering. Slowly, he begins to believe it. Not fully, not easily, but enough for the audience to sense a shift in the current of his life. The home, once a symbol of loss, becomes a beacon of possibility. Its walls rise not as boundaries but as invitations, to stay, to breathe, to belong. The light that filters through the unfinished windows begins to shape his features differently, casting away the shadows that once clung to him. He stands taller, moves with more intention, and begins to occupy his space with a sense of rightful presence. The message becomes clear: the true essence of Sisu is not merely the ability to endure suffering, it is the courage to rebuild in the aftermath, to choose life even when life has been merciless. And as Atami continues to shape his new beginning, the audience understands that revenge was never the endpoint of his journey. Survival was not the end. Even healing is not the end. The true end, the true triumph, is the quiet, determined act of becoming whole again. As more time passes within the quiet world Atami is shaping, the film begins to reveal that healing does not move in a single direction. Some days the progress feels tangible, almost visible in the way he carries himself. Other days, the weight of memory seems to settle upon him with a heaviness that slows every motion. This ebb and flow becomes the emotional heartbeat of the story, the reminder that recovery is not a destination but a state of constant negotiation. Atami begins to learn that peace is not something he arrives at, it is something he cultivates, often in the face of resistance from within. There are mornings when he steps outside and pauses, eyes scanning the horizon not for enemies but for the simple reassurance that the land is still there, unchanged, reliable. He takes in the shape of the sky, the distance between trees, the slow drift of clouds, all of it grounding him, reminding him that the world continues even when his memories try to pull him elsewhere. These quiet moments, filmed with an almost meditative stillness, create a rhythm of reflection that anchors his days. The landscape becomes a silent companion, a witness to the invisible battles he fights long after the physical fighting has ended. It is during these quiet transitions that the film subtly begins to explore the idea of self-forgiveness. This theme emerges not through dialogue, Atami speaks no words, but through the gradual shift in the way he behaves with himself. In the early stages of rebuilding, he worked with an unspoken urgency, as though trying to outrun something. But now, his pace slows. He allows himself to take breaks. He eats without rushing. He lets moments of contemplation linger instead of pushing them aside. This change reveals a deeper internal shift, he no longer sees rest as a vulnerability or reflection as a threat. These allowances, though small, mark significant breakthroughs in a man shaped so profoundly by necessity and survival. There is a moment, understated yet emotionally resonant, when Atami walks through the nearly completed structure and runs his hand along the wood. He touches it not as a builder checking his work, but as someone acknowledging that the space is beginning to feel like home. The gesture carries a quiet reverence, a tenderness that suggests he is finally allowing himself to imagine belonging again. This is not an easy shift for him, belonging means opening himself to the possibility of loss. Yet he does it anyway, showing that even after all he has endured, his capacity for hope has not been extinguished, only buried beneath the weight of grief. In this phase, the film begins to highlight the significance of simple, almost mundane actions. Atami fetching water, gathering firewood, tending a small patch of land, each act becomes a declaration that life, in its smallest forms, matters. These routines ground him in the present and create a structure for days that once felt empty and uncertain. This return to simplicity becomes a counterpoint to the chaos that once dominated his world. In a life once defined by violence, these quiet rituals become sacred. But the film does not shy away from acknowledging that fragments of the past still linger. There are nights when the shadows in his home stretch too long, triggering memories he cannot escape. Sometimes he wakes abruptly, chest rising with quick, sharp breaths, eyes scanning the darkness for threats that no longer exist. These episodes are portrayed with raw honesty, not as signs of weakness but as inevitable consequences of a life forged in trauma. The film treats these moments with a quiet respect, showing that healing does not erase the past, it teaches one how to live beside it. One of the most revealing sequences occurs when Atami encounters the remnants of an object destroyed years earlier, perhaps something belonging to his family, its meaning preserved only in his memory. He lifts it carefully, his face shifting with an emotion that is neither sorrow nor longing but something deeper, acceptance. The object is broken, like the past it represents, but he does not recoil from it. He does not discard it. Instead, he cleans it, sets it aside gently, and continues his work. This act becomes a metaphor for his entire journey. He cannot restore what was lost, but he can honor it. He can integrate its memory into the life he is building. In this moment, he demonstrates a profound emotional maturity, one that many survivors struggle for years to reach. As the structure of his home nears completion, the film's tone undergoes a subtle but powerful transformation. Light begins to play differently across the rooms. The shadows soften. The warmth becomes more consistent. These visual changes reflect not just the passage of time but his internal shift toward stability. The house is no longer simply a project, it has become an extension of him, a tangible representation of his resilience, his grief, and his unwavering refusal to surrender to despair. The final stages of construction bring out something unexpected in Atami, a sense of ritualistic care. He smooths the edges of wood with precision. He aligns beams with meticulous attention. He tightens each joint as though sealing a promise. Through these movements, the audience understands that this home is not merely a shelter, he is building a sanctuary, a place where the fragments of his life can coexist without conflict. In these final moments, there is an emotional clarity that emerges. Atami is no longer rebuilding only his home, he is rebuilding his identity. A man who once lived solely for survival is now shaping a life he intends to inhabit. The walls rise not as barriers but as boundaries that define a space of healing. The roof forms not as protection from enemies but as a haven from the burden of wandering. The door hangs not to keep danger out but to invite a sense of peace inward. And as the camera pulls back to reveal the nearly completed structure standing strong against the horizon, it becomes clear that Atami's journey has shifted from one of revenge to one of resto. As the days continue to pass in Atami's reconstructed world, the film slowly expands its exploration of what it truly means to reclaim agency after trauma. Previously, his survival depended on constant vigilance, on anticipating every threat, and on reacting with precision to forces beyond his control. Now, each decision he makes carries a different kind of weight. Choosing how to arrange a beam, deciding which piece of wood to preserve, even choosing to pause and simply observe the land becomes a declaration of autonomy. In the absence of conflict, the most ordinary decisions gain extraordinary significance. Every deliberate act affirms that life is no longer dictated by chaos and violence, it is something he can shape, slowly, intentionally, on his own terms. The film carefully contrasts these moments of intentional creation with flashes of memory that occasionally pierce his consciousness. He may catch a whiff of smoke, or hear a creaking sound, and instinctively tense as though danger lurks nearby. These reactions, deeply ingrained over years of survival, serve as reminders that trauma leaves traces long after the threat is gone. Yet the difference now is in how Atami responds. Instead of succumbing to fear, he observes, acknowledges the memory, and returns to his task. This marks a subtle but profound transformation. He has learned not to be controlled by the echoes of the past, but to integrate them into the present without being immobilized. Atami's connection with the land deepens in these moments. He begins to understand that the world itself is a living witness to both destruction and healing. He moves among trees that have grown back from fires, traces the outlines of past battles etched into the terrain, and observes the gradual return of animals once driven away by conflict. The camera often lingers on these interactions, drawing a parallel between the physical restoration of the land and the internal restoration of a man. In doing so, the film presents a meditation on the mutuality of recovery. Just as Atami nurtures the world around him, the world nurtures him in return. This interplay becomes a central motif, suggesting that resilience is both personal and relational, tied to the environment, memory, and the slow reclamation of normalcy. The narrative continues to emphasize subtle rituals as instruments of healing. Atami lights a small fire at dusk, carefully tending it as if marking the passage of the day not through work but through quiet acknowledgement. He moves with care as he aligns the last pieces of his home, his motions deliberate and patient. Even mundane tasks, like sweeping the floor or arranging a makeshift bench, acquire profound significance. Each action is both practical and symbolic, demonstrating that recovery is not an external achievement but a repeated assertion of life's worth. There are fleeting moments when his gaze meets distant signs of human activity, a village in the distance, a smoke plume from a far-off hearth. These glimpses remind him that the world continues beyond his solitude. Yet they do not draw him away. Instead, they reinforce the importance of his present work. His sanctuary is not merely a physical structure, it is the space in which he begins to reconcile his past with the possibility of a future. By creating boundaries that define safety, Atami reclaims the agency that war had stripped from him, asserting control over the first sphere of life he can shape entirely by his own will. Even in these quiet sequences, the film does not let the audience forget the costs that shaped him. Subtle reminders, scars on his hands, the occasional wince when lifting heavy beams, the faint echo of a past scream in a wind gust, keep his experiences tangible. Yet they exist alongside the signs of transformation, the careful alignment of walls, the precise hammer strikes, the growing harmony between man and environment. This juxtaposition underlines a critical theme: resilience does not erase suffering, it lives alongside it, strengthened by acceptance rather than denial. Atami's evolution reaches its most delicate expression in the way he allows himself small pleasures. A warm meal, the sound of birdsong, the sight of sunlight streaming through a newly installed window, these moments, once imperceptible in the urgency of survival, now carry weight. They are markers of life reclaimed, of attention paid to the present rather than solely to past or future threats. The film lingers on these details deliberately, communicating that the courage to notice and appreciate life, even in small increments, is a form of Sisu as profound as any physical feat. As the structure nears completion, the film emphasizes that the real victory lies not in finishing the home but in the ongoing act of inhabiting it. Atami's labor is continuous, not final, reflecting the truth that survival and healing are processes, not endpoints. The audience witnesses a man whose battles are no longer fought against an external enemy but against the inertia of grief, the echoes of violence, and the instinctual tension of years spent navigating danger. By choosing to engage with the world intentionally, he transforms these struggles into acts of creation and life affirmation. In these sequences, Sisu, Road to Revenge, makes clear that the essence of its story is no longer about revenge or external conflict. The narrative now resides in the profound, quiet domain of human endurance, the courage to face a scarred world, the discipline to keep building, and the ability to allow hope to emerge organically from the ruins of the past. Atami's journey is an extended meditation on how to reclaim humanity after trauma, how to live fully despite the shadows of memory, and how to assert meaning in a life that has witnessed the extreme consequences of its absence. And as he places the final piece in position, stepping back to survey the emerging home, there is a sense of arrival, not in completion, but in the acknowledgement of continuous effort. The camera holds on his profile against the horizon, a solitary figure framed not by violence but by quiet determination, a man who has not just survived, but begun to inhabit the life he has reclaimed. In this, the film delivers its most enduring message: true strength is measured not by destruction or triumph over enemies, but by the unyielding courage to live, rebuild, and embrace the fragile beauty of a life reclaimed from the ashes. As the days stretch into weeks and months, the film gradually immerses Atami in a rhythm that feels almost sacred, a rhythm dictated not by necessity or danger, but by the slow unfolding of life itself. The work on his home becomes more than labor, it becomes a meditation, a tangible manifestation of endurance and intention. Each beam lifted, each nail driven, and each surface smoothed is an act of reclaiming space not just physically, but spiritually. These repeated motions establish a tempo that contrasts sharply with the violent chaos of his past. The audience begins to sense that the real story of Sisu, Road to Revenge, is less about confrontation and more about this subtle assertion of agency, the conscious decision to shape a life worth inhabiting. Atami's relationship with silence deepens in these sequences. In the past, silence was a strategy, a shield, a way to survive threats that could strike at any moment. Now, silence becomes a companion, a container for thought and reflection. The film lingers on moments where he pauses mid-task, simply listening, the wind rustling through trees, distant water flowing, birds calling in patterns he has not noticed for years. These moments are quiet, almost imperceptible, yet they carry immense emotional weight. In them, Atami reconnects with the world on a level that had been inaccessible during his years of relentless survival. Silence, once a necessity, becomes a conduit for presence, grounding him in the reality of life rather than the memory of death. As he works, Atami demonstrates an increasing patience with both the world and himself. Tasks that once might have been hurried through in a need to prove competence or strength are now undertaken with care and deliberation. This shift reflects the internal growth of a man learning to live deliberately rather than reactively. It is evident in the way he examines materials before use, in the careful alignment of boards, in the way he touches each surface as though acknowledging its place in his life. These small gestures, repeated over time, accumulate into a visual and emotional language of healing. Memory continues to play an essential role in this process. Instead of overwhelming him, past experiences begin to inform his actions in subtle ways. Perhaps he recalls a technique his father or brother once taught him, or a moment of care shared with a loved one. These recollections are integrated into his work not as a source of grief but as guiding principles, anchors connecting his past to the present. In doing so, the film portrays memory as neither a burden nor a liability, but a tool that can assist in the construction of a renewed existence. Atami's engagement with memory becomes a form of quiet mastery. He has survived the past, and now he chooses how it will shape the present. The interaction between Atami and the natural environment continues to develop with subtle sophistication. He notices how sunlight shifts across the land at different times of day, how wind affects the sound and feel of the surroundings, how the soil responds to his labor. These observations are not incidental, they reflect the gradual return of attunement to the world, a world that was once a backdrop for danger and loss, but now becomes a canvas for possibility and reconstruction. The act of working alongside the rhythms of nature mirrors his internal process, patient, incremental, and respectful of forces beyond his immediate control. The film carefully depicts how resilience is built not only through physical action but through the cultivation of attention. Atami begins to notice details that once would have gone unseen, a pattern in the bark of a tree, the delicate curve of a stone, the changing colors of the sky. These observations signal the expansion of his awareness beyond mere survival. The narrative suggests that healing involves both action and perception, both work and witness, and that true endurance is as much about noticing life as it is about confronting death. At this stage of his journey, Atami's labor becomes deeply symbolic. Each completed section of the home represents not just progress in construction but a concrete assertion of existence in defiance of the violence that once sought to define him. The building is no longer just a structure, it is an extension of his identity, a physical manifestation of the principle that life, even after profound suffering, can still be directed toward creation and purpose. The audience is invited to read each carefully aligned beam and nailed plank as a reflection of his growing mastery over both the external and internal worlds. The subtle rituals he develops further reinforce this theme. Lighting a fire at dusk, tending small patches of earth, pausing to rest and breathe, all these acts are imbued with significance. They are small, ordinary behaviors elevated into gestures of defiance against the past. By investing attention, care, and intention into them, Atami transforms survival into flourishing. This is the essence of Sisu, enduring with courage, but more importantly, choosing to create meaning in a world that has already taken so much. Even as his home nears completion, the film portrays the ongoing presence of the past. Scars on his hands, quickened reflexes, and occasional tension in his movements remain as reminders of the life he once led. Yet these reminders no longer dominate him. Instead, they exist alongside the emerging patterns of renewal and peace, integrated into the broader narrative of survival and adaptation. The audience is shown that true strength is not erasing trauma but learning to coexist with it, allowing it to inform, not imprison, the present. And as Atami steps back to view his nearly finished home against the horizon, there is a profound sense of accomplishment, not as a triumph over an enemy but as an affirmation of life itself. His journey has shifted from vengeance to restoration, from survival to intentional living. The act of building, sustained over time, becomes a meditation on human endurance, demonstrating that courage is as much about persistence in quiet, daily acts as it is about facing extraordinary dangers. In this way, Sisu, Road to Revenge moves beyond the story of a single man and becomes a meditation on the human spirit. It illustrates that the most difficult battles are not always those fought with fists or weapons, but those fought within, the battles to reclaim oneself, to reinvest in the world, and to find the courage to exist fully despite the shadows of memory. Atami's story becomes a universal testament. Survival is not merely living, it is the continual act of asserting presence, meaning, and life in a world that has tested the very limits of endurance. As Atami inhabits the nearly completed home, the film shifts to an even more profound meditation on presence, purpose, and the subtle triumph of human spirit over circumstance. The story, once dominated by external conflict and the immediacy of survival, now emphasizes the internal terrain of endurance. The viewer is invited to witness the rhythm of a life that has been reclaimed, where every small action, every careful motion, carries significance far beyond its immediate function. In this space, Atami's world becomes a laboratory for resilience, a study of how one man can transform suffering into intentional creation, silence into awareness, and memory into guidance. There is a remarkable attention to the way time itself is represented. Days pass slowly, often without overt markers of change except for the shifting light, the growing warmth, and the subtle alterations in the environment. This slow rhythm mirrors Atami's own internal pace. Where once life was a rapid succession of threats demanding instantaneous reactions, now each movement is measured, deliberate enough to allow reflection and integration. The film's pacing reinforces the thematic core. Healing, much like building a home, is a process, not an event. The audience is immersed in this temporal framework, sensing the continuity of effort and the depth of patience required to sustain it. During this phase, Atami demonstrates an increasing capacity for observation and reflection. He notices the alignment of beams, the stability of walls, the patterns of wind and sun. But beyond these practical assessments, he begins to observe life itself, the subtle ways in which nature adapts, survives, and grows. The return of birds to trees, the small shoots pushing through soil once scorched, the gentle curves of light across the horizon, these details are not decorative, they are central to the film's meditation on interconnected resilience. Atami's growing attunement to these rhythms suggests a psychological and spiritual restoration that parallels the physical reconstruction of his home. By aligning his inner state with the world around him, he achieves a balance that was previously unimaginable. Memory continues to function as both anchor and guide. Past experiences, once sources of trauma, now appear as subtle cues in his decision-making and perception. The film often frames these moments visually rather than narratively. A glance at a scar triggers a flash of learned skill, a certain movement recalls a lesson in precision, a fragment of a sound evokes instinctual knowledge. These memories are no longer chains, they are tools that allow Atami to navigate life with greater depth and awareness. Through this integration, the film articulates a profound principle. True resilience is not forgetting the past, but weaving it into the fabric of present purpose. Atami's relationship with routine also emerges as a quiet act of resistance against despair. The daily repetition of seemingly ordinary tasks, fetching water, tending a fire, aligning boards, becomes a meditation on the sanctity of life and the significance of intentional action. Each task is invested with meaning, demonstrating that courage is not only found in acts of extraordinary heroism but in the sustained commitment to living and creating despite the shadows of memory. This subtle insistence on routine conveys the film's deeper philosophy. The cultivation of life itself is an act of defiance, a reclaiming of agency in a world that has sought to diminish it. The environment around Atami continues to play an essential role in articulating these themes. Nature, once a backdrop for survival, is now an active participant in his reconstruction and healing. The gentle sway of trees, the movement of sunlight across the land, the quiet return of animals, these elements reflect the possibility of renewal and the slow reordering of life after trauma. The camera lingers on these details not to beautify but to draw attention to their emotional and symbolic significance. Atami exists within a living, responsive world, and his actions contribute to the restoration of harmony, both external and internal. As his home approaches completion, Atami's movements convey mastery over both space and self. The placement of each structural element demonstrates not just technical skill, but an internal alignment, his mind, body, and memory acting in concert. He is no longer reacting solely out of instinct, nor is he driven by fear. He operates from a place of presence and purpose, illustrating that the culmination of Sisu is not brute strength, but disciplined perseverance and the capacity to act with intention. The act of creation becomes an embodiment of resilience, a living testament to the principle that endurance is ultimately measured by the ability to produce, nurture, and sustain life. Even in moments of solitude, the film emphasizes the continuity of effort. Atami does not pause to celebrate or reflect triumphantly, the narrative portrays him instead as steady, persistent, fully absorbed in the act of living. This approach communicates a profound truth: the most significant victories are not those recognized by others or defined by external markers, but those enacted quietly, consistently, and without fanfare. The discipline to maintain presence, to continue building when no one is watching, is framed as the deepest expression of courage. Throughout this stage, the scars of the past remain visible. His hands, marked by years of labor and conflict, testify to the journey that brought him here. Quickened reflexes occasionally betray lingering instincts. And yet, these reminders of history do not dominate him, they coexist with the emerging patterns of intentional life. Atami has learned not to erase these traces, but to inhabit them as integral parts of his identity. In this coexistence lies the film's most profound meditation: survival is not the absence of pain, but the ability to continue creating meaning in its presence. As the final touches of his home are set into place, the narrative conveys a deep sense of resolution without conventional closure. There is no dramatic declaration, no final confrontation, no overt triumph. Instead, the victory is subtle and enduring. Atami exists fully in a space he has claimed and shaped. He has moved from being defined by past violence to being defined by the deliberate, sustained act of living. The structure before him, aligned against the horizon, stands as a visual and symbolic representation of resilience, agency, and the enduring power of Sisu. In these closing sequences, the film articulates a universal message: the essence of courage and strength is not measured solely in extraordinary feats or revenge against enemies, but in the quiet, persistent choice to rebuild, to create, and to inhabit life fully after trauma. Atami Korpi, through his patient labor and unwavering determination, becomes a living embodiment of this principle. His journey transcends individual narrative, offering a meditation on the human capacity to endure, restore, and embrace the fragile beauty of existence, even in the aftermath of profound suffering. As Atami inhabits the finished structure, the film transitions into a deeper contemplation of what it means to inhabit life fully after trauma. The home itself, once a project of labor and survival, now becomes a living extension of his restored self. Every beam, every floorboard, every corner carries the imprint of patience, attention, and endurance. In this space, Atami is no longer defined solely by his past, he is defined by the deliberate act of presence, the quiet assertion that life, though scarred, is still worth inhabiting. The camera lingers on moments of stillness, him sitting near a fire, watching the shifting light of the day, listening to distant sounds that once might have signaled danger but now signify continuity. In these sequences, the film emphasizes that survival has transformed into sustained living, and that living deliberately is itself a form of victory. The narrative gradually highlights a reconciliation with memory. Past traumas, which once dictated every movement, now coexist alongside the daily acts of creation and observation. Atami does not erase these memories, nor does he allow them to dominate him. Instead, they inform his choices and movements with subtlety, guiding rather than controlling him. This integration demonstrates a profound understanding. Resilience is not the absence of trauma but the capacity to incorporate it without surrendering to it. His scars, physical and emotional, become markers of survival, not sources of limitation. Through this lens, the film conveys a philosophy that true strength is not measured in victories over others, but in mastery over oneself. In this phase, Atami's interactions with the natural world deepen, forming a dialogue between human endurance and the resilience of life itself. He observes how plants respond to sunlight, how water flows along gentle slopes, how birds return to the trees he once cleared. These moments are not decorative, they are symbolic. The film emphasizes that just as Atami rebuilds his home and life, the world around him reclaims its vitality. The interdependence of personal recovery and environmental renewal reinforces the theme that healing is not a solitary act, it is a dialogue with the living world, a mutual recognition of survival and continuity. Small rituals continue to define his life. He lights fires with care, arranges tools and materials meticulously, and takes time to rest and observe the environment. Each ritual is both practical and symbolic, a demonstration of his ability to impose order on chaos and to create meaning in the everyday. These repeated actions, shown without dialogue, communicate more powerfully than words ever could, that courage lies not only in extraordinary feats but in the consistent, patient cultivation of life itself. The film emphasizes that this form of Sisu, resilience, persistence, and deliberate action, is as heroic as any battle won in the past. Even in moments of solitude, the past is present. Atami's reflexes occasionally betray lingering instincts, a faint tension still resides in his shoulders, and memory sometimes emerges in flashes. Yet the film portrays these not as obstacles but as integrated elements of his identity. He has learned to live alongside them, to inhabit a self that carries history without being imprisoned by it. The subtle coexistence of past and present becomes a meditation on how humans navigate the scars of life, acknowledging them, honoring them, but not allowing them to define the entirety of existence. As the narrative moves toward its resolution, the camera often frames Atami in relation to the horizon, emphasizing the continuity of life beyond his immediate surroundings. The horizon suggests both limitation and possibility, the challenges of the past recede, but the potential of the future remains. In this framing, the film conveys that the act of living deliberately, of rebuilding and maintaining presence, is an ongoing journey rather than a finite achievement. The home stands not just as a physical structure, but as a metaphor for self-mastery, resilience, and the embodiment of Sisu itself. The final sequences emphasize the philosophical core of the story. Revenge, once a driving force, has been replaced by restoration. Survival, once a matter of instinct, has become an act of intention. Healing, once fragmented, has transformed into a continuous practice of presence, creation, and integration. Atami's journey demonstrates that the ultimate victory is not external, there is no enemy to vanquish, but internal, the courage to inhabit a life fully, despite scars, memories, and lingering shadows. It is a triumph of endurance, of agency, and of quiet, deliberate resilience. In the film's closing moments, Atami stands within the home, framed by sunlight streaming through the windows, observing the land that has borne witness to both destruction and renewal. There is no fanfare, no dramatic crescendo, only the profound simplicity of a man who has survived, rebuilt, and reclaimed his existence. The message is clear: true strength is measured not by the capacity to destroy or conquer, but by the courage to rebuild, to nurture, and to live intentionally in a world that has tested every limit of endurance. Sisu, in its purest form, is revealed as the sustained, deliberate act of living fully, no matter the weight of the past. The film leaves the audience with a lingering sense of quiet triumph. Atami's story, while intensely personal, becomes universal, a testament to the human capacity to endure, restore, and inhabit life with courage and dignity. It demonstrates that the deepest victories are not those recognized by others or marked by spectacle, but those enacted daily, in silence, with patience, and with unwavering resolve. In the end, Sisu, Road to Revenge is less a tale of revenge than a meditation on the endurance, resilience, and quiet heroism inherent in living fully, even after profound suffering. In the concluding sequences, the film brings Atami's journey to its fullest realization, allowing the audience to witness the culmination of years of endurance, loss, and deliberate rebuilding. The home, once a labor of necessity, now embodies a sanctuary of purpose and presence. Atami moves within it with a quiet confidence, each step measured, each gesture intentional. There is a palpable shift in his demeanor. He no longer carries the tension of constant vigilance, nor does he act solely out of memory or instinct. Instead, he inhabits the present fully, aware of his past but unbound by it. The film conveys that the essence of Sisu, an almost spiritual perseverance, is not merely survival, but the courage to continue shaping life even after trauma has threatened to destroy all meaning. The narrative emphasizes the continuity of effort as the core of human resilience. Every task, from arranging the final boards of his home to observing the world beyond its walls, becomes a deliberate affirmation of life. In these sequences, the camera lingers on subtle details, the way sunlight falls across his face, the movement of leaves outside, the sounds of birds returning to the land. These elements reinforce the idea that life, even after devastation, carries beauty, rhythm, and possibility. Atami's engagement with the natural world illustrates the integration of past experience with present attention. He has learned to coexist with memory, trauma, and loss, allowing them to guide him without dominating his existence. Throughout the film, memory has been both a burden and a tool, and in these final moments it becomes a source of quiet mastery. Scars on his hands, faint tension in his shoulders, and occasional reflexive gestures remind the audience of the life he once lived, a life defined by struggle, loss, and violence. Yet these reminders coexist with his emerging patterns of intentional living, demonstrating that true strength is not the erasure of past suffering but the capacity to inhabit life fully alongside it. Atami's journey shows that resilience is relational, both internal and external. It is built through interaction with the world, attention to small acts, and the ongoing effort to integrate experience into purpose. The film's resolution emphasizes that the ultimate form of courage is not revenge, nor even survival in the traditional sense, but the sustained act of creation and presence. Atami's home is more than a physical structure, it is a manifestation of his restored agency, a testament to the principle that living deliberately is an act of defiance against the forces that once sought to diminish him. The careful alignment of beams, the tending of small fires, and the patient observation of his surroundings all function as symbolic markers of personal mastery. Each action affirms that life, no matter how scarred, can be meaningful, and that persistence itself is a profound triumph. The film's visual language underscores this transformation. Wide shots of the completed home framed against the recovering landscape suggest harmony between the individual and the world, while lingering close-ups capture the subtle emotional shifts in Atami's face, relief, acceptance, and the quiet contentment of presence. These moments reinforce the film's core message: Sisu is not demonstrated in explosive feats of heroism or acts of vengeance, but in the quiet, patient, and consistent choice to continue, to rebuild, and to create a life worth inhabiting. Atami's final gestures are imbued with symbolic weight. As he surveys the horizon, observing the continuity of the natural world and the resilience of life around him, the audience understands that his journey has moved from reactive survival to intentional living. He has reclaimed his autonomy, reconstructed his environment, and reconciled his past with a present that is both bearable and meaningful. This reconciliation is the true climax of the film, not a violent confrontation or dramatic triumph, but the achievement of balance, presence, and self-possession. In the closing moments, the narrative emphasizes endurance as an ongoing, living practice. Atami does not declare victory or engage in fanfare, instead, he simply exists, fully present in the space he has claimed. The film leaves the audience with a sense of quiet resolution. Life is not perfect, and scars remain, but the ability to continue shaping one's existence, to inhabit the world with attention and care, is the ultimate testament to human courage. In this, Sisu, Road to Revenge elevates the concept of Sisu beyond physical resilience or revenge, presenting it as a philosophy of life, the persistent, deliberate act of living fully, creating meaning, and asserting presence even in the aftermath of profound trauma. Ultimately, Atami Korpi's journey transcends individual narrative, becoming a universal meditation on the capacity of the human spirit. The film suggests that the deepest victories are internal, realized not in spectacle or conquest but in the quiet persistence of rebuilding, observing, and inhabiting life with dignity. Through patient labor, attention to detail, and the cultivation of presence, Atami embodies the purest form of Sisu, the courage to endure, to create, and to live intentionally in a world that has tested him beyond measure. His story concludes not with an external triumph but with the profound affirmation that survival, when combined with purpose and mindfulness, transforms into the most profound and enduring form of victory. After reclaiming his home and integrating the lessons of the past into his daily existence, Atami begins to extend his awareness beyond his immediate environment, sensing a connection between personal endurance and the wider cycles of life around him. The camera frequently frames him alongside sweeping vistas, vast forests, and open skies, emphasizing not only his solitude but also his part in a world that continues independently of human conflict. The film underscores a profound realization: true resilience encompasses recognition of one's place in the continuum of life. The struggles of the past remain a defining part of Atami's identity, but they are no longer the totality of it, they are threads woven into the larger fabric of existence. In this phase, Atami begins to engage in acts of quiet stewardship. He tends to the land surrounding his home, noticing small details that signal growth, change, and regeneration. He observes water flowing through cleared paths, patches of grass returning after years of neglect, and the cautious return of wildlife to previously abandoned areas. These sequences reflect the film's meditation on the interdependence of human resilience and environmental renewal. Just as Atami rebuilds himself and his home, the land responds with subtle recovery. The narrative suggests that Sisu is not only an inward-directed endurance but also a participatory engagement with the world, a continuous dialogue with forces both within and beyond the self. Memory continues to serve as a guiding presence, shaping his understanding without overwhelming his daily life. Past experiences surface in fleeting reflections, a flash of recognition when touching a familiar tool, a shadow of a memory when noticing the curve of a branch, a recollection of a lesson once learned during hardship. These are not distractions but markers, helping him navigate the delicate balance between remembrance and forward movement. The film emphasizes that resilience does not erase history, it incorporates it, allowing past challenges to inform choices while not dictating them. Through this integration, Atami exemplifies the idea that true strength is both adaptive and reflective, combining the wisdom of experience with the courage to act intentionally in the present. Rituals remain central to his recovery. The repetitive tasks of lighting fires, arranging tools, tending small portions of land, and observing the surrounding environment evolve from practical necessities into meditative practices. They reinforce the principle that persistence and mindfulness are inseparable components of enduring strength. Through repeated attention and care, Atami asserts presence in the world, a presence that is deliberate, sustained, and deeply meaningful. These sequences also highlight a core tenet of Sisu: courage is revealed not only through extraordinary acts but through consistent, patient engagement with life's everyday challenges. Atami's solitude becomes increasingly reflective rather than isolating. The film portrays him as attuned to the subtle rhythms of his surroundings, the pattern of light and shadow, the interplay of wind and leaves, the slow passage of seasons. This attunement conveys that recovery and resilience are not solitary processes alone, but are strengthened through attentive engagement with the living world. The audience witnesses a profound transformation. The man who once survived through constant vigilance now thrives through deliberate observation, patience, and alignment with natural rhythms. The narrative demonstrates that Sisu is not limited to endurance in crisis, it extends into the ongoing cultivation of life, connection, and awareness. The final sequences in this keynote progression depict a synthesis of all prior lessons. Atami moves with confidence, yet without hubris, reflecting mastery over his environment and his inner self. His actions are purposeful, measured, and grounded in an awareness of both the fragility and resilience of life. He continues to integrate the memories of loss and trauma into the ongoing practice of living fully, showing that endurance is dynamic, relational, and reflective. In doing so, the film broadens its thematic scope, suggesting that the principles of Sisu, courage, persistence, and deliberate action, are universally applicable, extending beyond the individual to the larger rhythms of existence. In these concluding moments, the narrative affirms that the greatest achievements are not externally validated but internally realized. Atami does not conquer enemies, seek recognition, or engage in dramatic displays of triumph. Instead, he embodies a quiet, sustained victory, the courage to inhabit life fully, to maintain awareness and presence, and to continue creating and nurturing despite past suffering. The home he has built, the land he tends, and the mindfulness he cultivates all converge as tangible symbols of enduring resilience. Through his journey, the film communicates a universal meditation on human strength, that the ultimate measure of courage is not simply surviving adversity, but persistently shaping life with care, intention, and dignity. The overarching message resonates beyond Atami's personal story. Sisu, Road to Revenge conveys that while trauma and suffering may leave indelible marks, they need not define the entirety of one's existence. Through consistent effort, intentional presence, and the integration of memory with action, humans possess the capacity to reclaim autonomy, restore balance, and engage meaningfully with the world around them. Atami's narrative exemplifies this philosophy, illustrating that the essence of Sisu is as much about rebuilding the self and finding harmony with life as it is about enduring extraordinary hardship.